After the family barbecue, I noticed my savings had vanished. My cousin smirked. "Consider it a donation. You make more anyway." I stood up, shaking, and declared, "Then you'll appreciate the surprise I left upstairs." They laughed until tires screeched outside. I, 34M, never thought I'd be writing this, but here we are. Last weekend's family barbecue started like any other, my cousin showing up uninvited, eating my food, and making himself comfortable in my home. What I discovered afterward changed everything. The barbecue itself was typical family chaos. Everyone gathered in my backyard, kids running around, adults drinking beer and complaining about work. My cousin had that same smug expression he'd worn since childhood, the one that always meant trouble was brewing. He spent most of the afternoon making comments about my job, my house, how I'd lucked out in life while he was still struggling. I brushed it off like always. Family gatherings meant tolerating his attitude for a few hours, then sending everyone home with leftovers. Nothing unusual there. The real shock came Monday morning when I checked my bank account before work. My savings account, which had contained nearly $8,000, showed a balance of $12.37. My hand started shaking as I refreshed the page, hoping it was some kind of error. But there it was, a withdrawal for $7,987, processed Saturday afternoon, right around the time everyone was at my house. I called the bank immediately, demanding answers. The representative explained that someone had accessed my account using my online banking credentials. The transaction came from my home IP address. My blood ran cold. Only one person had been upstairs during the barbecue. My cousin had asked to use the bathroom, but I'd noticed he'd been gone for almost 20 minutes. When he came back down, he'd seemed unusually cheerful. I drove straight to his apartment, my mind racing with anger and disbelief. How had he gotten my banking information? Had he gone through my computer while everyone else was distracted outside? He answered the door with that same irritating smirk, like he'd been expecting me. Before I could even speak, he started talking about how I shouldn't be so uptight about money, how I made plenty at my engineering job, how families should help each other out. I asked him directly if he'd taken my money. His response made my blood boil. He called it a donation, said I'd barely miss it anyway, that he needed it more than I did. He actually seemed proud of himself, like he'd pulled off some brilliant scheme. When I threatened to call the police, he laughed. He reminded me that I couldn't prove anything, that it would be his word against mine, that family drama like this would just make everyone uncomfortable. He suggested I consider it a lesson about being more careful with my passwords. That's when I knew I had to do something. Not just about the money, but about his complete lack of remorse. He'd violated my home, stolen my savings, and acted like I should thank him for it. I left his apartment without another word, but my mind was already working on a plan. See, my cousin didn't know that I'd installed a comprehensive security system 6 months ago. Hidden cameras throughout the house, motion sensors, the works. I'd done it after a break-in in the neighborhood, but I'd never mentioned it to family. That night, I reviewed the footage from Saturday. There he was, clear as day, sneaking into my home office while everyone else was outside. The timestamp showed him sitting at my computer for 18 minutes, typing away. The camera angle captured everything. Him logging into my banking account, transferring my money to his account, even him taking a selfie afterward. But I didn't go to the police right away. I had a better idea. I spent the next few days researching, planning, making phone calls. My cousin thought he was so clever, but he'd made several critical mistakes. First, he'd used his real account for the transfer. Second, he'd been bragging about his sudden windfall to mutual friends and family members. Third, he had no idea what I did for a living beyond knowing I made decent money. What he didn't know was that I worked in cybersecurity for a major financial institution. I had connections, resources, and a very particular set of skills. I started by documenting everything. The security footage, bank records, screenshots of his social media posts showing him suddenly buying expensive items he couldn't normally afford. I built an airtight case that would make any prosecutor smile. But I also did something else. Something that would make the lesson stick. My cousin had always been careless with his personal information. Over the years, he'd shared passwords, used the same login for multiple accounts, posted personal details on social media without thinking. It took me less than a day to map out his entire digital footprint. I discovered he'd been running a small cash-only handyman business while collecting unemployment benefits. His social media was full of evidence, photos of jobs he'd completed, complaints about difficult customers, even posts bragging about getting paid under the table. He'd been defrauding the state for almost 2 years. I also found out he'd been lying to his girlfriend about his finances. She thought he was broke and struggling, but he'd actually been hiding money from side jobs. The same girlfriend who'd been paying most of their rent and buying groceries because she believed he couldn't contribute. But the most interesting discovery was his involvement in a small-time fraud scheme with 2 of his friends. They'd been filing false insurance claims, creating fake receipts, even staging minor accidents to collect payouts. Nothing huge, but definitely illegal. I compiled everything into a comprehensive file: bank fraud evidence for the FBI, unemployment fraud documentation for the state, insurance fraud details for the relevant companies, and a nice summary for his girlfriend showing exactly how he'd been lying to her. Then I planned my reveal. I called him up, told him I wanted to meet at a family restaurant to discuss the situation like adults. He agreed, probably thinking he'd worn me down, that I was ready to let it go. We met at the same place where our family had celebrated his graduation years ago, back when I still believed he might turn his life around. He showed up wearing a new jacket and expensive sneakers, probably bought with my money. He sat across from me with that same arrogant expression, waiting for me to start groveling or begging for my money back. Instead, I told him I'd found a way to solve our problem. I explained that I'd been thinking about his situation, how he clearly needed money more than I did, how maybe there was a way we could work something out. He leaned forward, interested now, probably expecting me to offer him more money or agree to some payment plan. That's when I told him about my little discovery project. I started with the security footage, watching his face change as he realized I had him on camera. Then I mentioned the unemployment fraud, the insurance scams, the lies to his girlfriend. With each revelation, he got paler and more uncomfortable. By the time I'd finished laying out everything I'd found, he was sweating despite the air conditioning. He tried to deny everything at first, then switched to making excuses, then finally started begging me not to turn him in. I told him I'd already made copies of everything and stored them safely. The evidence was documented, organized, and ready to go. All I had to do was decide where to send it first. He asked what I wanted, what it would take to make this go away. I could see the desperation in his eyes now, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. I told him it was simple. He had 24 hours to return every penny he'd stolen, plus interest to cover the inconvenience. He also needed to confess everything to his girlfriend and stop the unemployment fraud immediately. If he did all of that, I'd consider keeping the insurance fraud information to myself. He tried to negotiate, claiming he'd already spent most of the money, that he couldn't pay it back right away. I reminded him about all those expensive purchases I'd seen on his social media, suggested he might want to start returning things. That's when he got angry, started making threats about what he'd do if I ruined his life. He actually had the nerve to suggest that I was the problem here, that I was being vindictive over a simple misunderstanding between family members. I let him rant for a few minutes, then calmly reminded him that he'd committed multiple felonies, that I had evidence of everything, and that his threats were just making his situation worse. I also pointed out that I'd recorded our entire conversation, including his confession and threats. He deflated like a punctured balloon, finally understanding that he'd messed with the wrong person. I left him sitting there and went home to wait. Update 1. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls and dozens of text messages. My cousin had apparently spent the night in panic mode, finally grasping the full scope of his problems. His messages started angry, then became pleading, then desperate. He wanted to meet again, wanted to explain himself, wanted another chance. I ignored them all. Around noon, I got a call from his girlfriend. She'd found out about everything: the stolen money, the unemployment fraud, the lies about his finances. She'd kicked him out of their apartment and was asking if I had any advice about getting her name off their shared bills. I felt bad for her. She'd been genuinely trying to help someone she thought was struggling, only to discover she'd been supporting a fraud. I gave her some basic legal advice and the number for a friend who specialized in financial disputes. By evening, my cousin had managed to scrape together about half of what he owed me. He'd returned the jacket and shoes, sold some electronics, even borrowed money from other relatives. But he was still short $4,000. That's when he made his biggest mistake. Instead of coming clean and asking for more time, he decided to try intimidation. He showed up at my house with 2 of his friends, the same friends who'd been helping him with the insurance fraud. They wanted to talk about the situation. I watched them through my security system as they approached my front door. They looked angry and determined, probably planning to threaten me into backing down. What they didn't know was that I'd already anticipated this possibility. I opened the door before they could knock, staying calm while they tried to crowd into my space. My cousin started making demands, saying he'd done enough to make things right, that I needed to destroy the evidence and forget the whole thing. His friends stood behind him trying to look intimidating, but I could see they were nervous. They probably had no idea about the extent of their own legal exposure. I told them they were trespassing and needed to leave immediately. When they refused, I mentioned that I'd already contacted law enforcement about the insurance fraud ring they'd been running. I watched their faces change as they realized I knew about their involvement too. That's when one of them made the fatal error of grabbing my arm and threatening to make me sorry if I didn't cooperate. I calmly informed them that they were all on camera, that their threats were being recorded, and that they'd just escalated from fraud to assault. The smart friend immediately backed away and started walking toward their car. The other one looked confused, still not understanding the situation. My cousin was turning red, probably realizing that he'd just made everything 10 times worse. I told them they had 30 seconds to get off my property before I called 911. I also mentioned that I had additional evidence about their activities that I'd been planning to keep private, but their visit was making me reconsider that decision. They left, but not before my cousin shouted some threats about how this wasn't over, how I'd regret messing with him. I made sure to get a clear recording of every word. Update 2. I didn't have to wait long for the consequences of their visit. The next morning, I received a call from my cousin's parole officer. Apparently, he'd failed to mention that he was still on probation from a previous conviction for check fraud. The threatening behavior in association with known criminals violated the terms of his release. I hadn't known about the parole situation, but it explained a lot about his desperation. Getting arrested again would mean serious prison time. I decided it was time to stop playing games. I drove to the police station and filed a comprehensive report. Bank fraud, computer intrusion, identity theft, harassment, threats, the whole package. I brought printouts of all my evidence, including the security footage and recordings from our conversations. The detective assigned to the case was impressed with the documentation. He told me it was one of the most organized cases he'd seen, that most people didn't think to preserve evidence so thoroughly. While I was at the station, I also reported the unemployment fraud to the state investigation unit and sent the insurance fraud information to the relevant companies. If my cousin wanted to play hardball, I was ready to go all the way. That afternoon, I got a panic call from my aunt, my cousin's mother. She'd somehow found out about the investigation and was begging me to drop the charges. She offered to pay back the stolen money herself, promised that her son would get help, pleaded with me to think about family loyalty. It was a difficult conversation. I'd always liked my aunt, and I could hear the genuine distress in her voice. But I also knew that she'd been enabling her son's behavior for years, bailing him out of every problem he created. I told her I appreciated her offer, but that this had gone beyond money. Her son had violated my home, stolen my savings, threatened me, and shown absolutely no remorse. Even now, instead of taking responsibility, he was hiding behind family members and making excuses. She started crying, talking about how prison would ruin his life, how he had a chance to turn things around if I'd just give him another opportunity. I felt terrible, but I also remembered his smirking face when he'd called my stolen money a donation. I told her I'd consider dropping the charges if her son met 3 conditions: return every penny he'd stolen, publicly confess to the family what he'd done, and enter a court-supervised rehabilitation program for gambling and fraud addiction. If he completed all 3 steps, I'd ask the prosecutor to consider a plea agreement. She agreed immediately, promising to make sure he complied with everything. But I'd been down this road before with my cousin. Promises were easy when consequences were looming. Update 3. The court hearing was scheduled for the following Friday. My cousin had managed to return most of the stolen money by selling his car and borrowing from relatives, but he was still fighting the confession requirement. He'd hired a lawyer who was advising him to take a plea deal without admitting guilt publicly. The lawyer argued that confession to the family wasn't legally necessary and would only cause additional embarrassment. I understood the legal strategy, but it missed the point entirely. The money was just part of the problem. The bigger issue was his complete lack of accountability, is willingness to hurt family members without consequence. On Wednesday, 2 days before the hearing, I received an unexpected visitor. My cousin's girlfriend, his ex-girlfriend now, came to my house with a box of documents. She'd been going through their shared finances and had discovered additional evidence of his fraudulent activities. Credit cards opened in both their names that she'd never authorized, loans he'd taken using her information as a reference, even attempts to access her bank account using information he'd stolen from her purse. The scope of his deception was staggering. She was terrified that she'd be held responsible for debts he'd created in her name. She'd already spent hundreds of dollars on legal consultations, trying to separate her finances from his fraudulent activities. I felt awful for her. She'd genuinely cared about him, supported him when she thought he was struggling, and this was how he'd repaid her trust. It reminded me why I couldn't just let this slide. We spent the evening going through the documents, organizing everything chronologically, building a timeline of his fraudulent activities. The pattern was clear. Whenever he got into financial trouble, he'd steal from whoever was closest and most vulnerable. She decided to file her own police report about the identity theft. She also agreed to testify at his hearing if needed, though I could see how much the decision was costing her emotionally. That night, I got a call from my cousin. He'd somehow found out about his ex-girlfriend's visit and was furious that she'd betrayed him by bringing me additional evidence. He actually blamed her for making his legal situation worse, as if she was responsible for his criminal behavior. He made one last attempt to negotiate, offering to pay additional money if I'd agree to a plea bargain that avoided prison time. When I refused, he got angry again, falling back into the same pattern of threats and intimidation that had gotten him into deeper trouble. I reminded him that every conversation we'd had was recorded, that his continued threats were just providing more evidence for the prosecution, and that he'd have been much better off accepting responsibility from the beginning. Friday morning arrived with surprising developments. My cousin's lawyer had advised him to accept a plea agreement that included restitution, probation, and community service. No prison time, but a felony conviction that would follow him for years. At the hearing, he finally seemed to understand the gravity of his situation. Gone was the smirking confidence, replaced by genuine fear as he listened to the prosecutor read the charges against him. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before accepting the plea, he looked directly at me and offered what seemed like a sincere apology. He admitted he'd made terrible decisions, that he'd hurt people who trusted him, and that he needed to change his behavior. It was the first time I'd heard him take real responsibility for his actions. The judge accepted the plea agreement, but added additional conditions I hadn't expected. My cousin would be required to attend financial responsibility classes, submit to random drug and alcohol testing, and perform 200 hours of community service specifically related to fraud prevention education. He would also be prohibited from accessing computers or the internet without supervision for the first year of his probation, effectively ending his ability to commit cyber fraud. As we left the courthouse, my aunt thanked me for not pushing for prison time. She seemed to finally understand that her son's problems required more than family intervention. My cousin avoided eye contact as he walked past, but his lawyer stopped to shake my hand. He told me that cases with such thorough documentation made his job much easier, and that he hoped my cousin would learn from this experience. 6 months later, I can say the outcome exceeded my expectations. My cousin completed the financial responsibility classes and discovered he had a genuine talent for budgeting and money management. The community service requirement led to a part-time job with a nonprofit organization that helps people avoid financial fraud. He's been consistent with restitution payments and hasn't missed any probation appointments. More importantly, he seems to have developed some genuine insight into how his behavior affected other people. His ex-girlfriend successfully cleared her credit report and moved to another state for a fresh start. She sent me a thank you card saying that my willingness to document everything had saved her from years of financial problems. The insurance companies recovered significant money from the fraud ring, and my cousin's friends received their own legal consequences. None of them will be running scams anytime soon. As for me, I learned some valuable lessons about family boundaries and the importance of consequences. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their destructive behavior. I also upgraded my home security system and started using more sophisticated password protection. Trust, but verify, especially when it comes to family. The money was important, But the real victory was watching my cousin transform from an entitled criminal into someone who's actually contributing to society. Sometimes people need to hit rock bottom before they're willing to change direction. I still see him at family gatherings occasionally. He's quieter now, more thoughtful, and he actually thanks me for not letting him get away with it. He says prison would have destroyed him, but the plea agreement gave him a chance to rebuild his life the right way. Looking back, I'm glad I chose documentation and legal consequences over family drama and empty threats. Real change requires real accountability, and sometimes that means involving the authorities when family intervention isn't enough. My savings account is back to where it should be, plus interest. But more importantly, I don't have to worry about my cousin viewing me as an easy target anymore. Respect, it turns out, sometimes requires consequences.